If I told you that real love knew no boundaries, you might report me to your therapist. You would be right to do so. Because the kind of love that we sometimes talk about with our therapists or that we do interpersonally, that's the stuff that we do need to have boundaries around, where some sense of where I end and you begin is critical to how we interact with one another and our world. But Unitarian Universalists love to throw the word love around. And sometimes it's like those other four-letter words that when you use it too much, it loses its meaning, loses its punch. And so I think it's important that we are clear what kind of love we're talking about, because I want to talk today about a kind of love that indeed does not have boundaries, cannot have boundaries, cannot have limits. But it's not that kind of love like that you talk about with your family and your partner and your therapist and all that. So don't report me to your therapist. And as Unitarian Universalists, we do talk about love a lot. It's the whole slogan of our sort of justice campaign at the Unitarian Universalist Association called Side with Love. Thank you for wearing one of the yellow shirts. You don't know you're a plant, but you totally are. Right? We have the yellow shirts that we sometimes wear to justice functions. We're the love people, which, I feel like the love people is not exactly the branding I would personally choose, but you got to go with what you got, and it's what we got. And when we talk about that kind of love, that surpassing love, that all-encompassing love, part of what we mean is widening our circle, right? Of taking the circle of who has privilege, who has choice, who has possibility, and we want to expand it, we want to widen it, make it bigger, draw the circle wide even. But it's funny, this word love, that we have such a fondness for, that putting that at the center of what we do as Unitarian Universalists is not as simple or easy or inevitable as we sometimes think it is. So, at the Unitarian Universalist Association level, right, at the big macro, all-encompassing level, the UUA is undergoing a process to rewrite Article 2 of its bylaws, which perhaps does not sound as spicy or exciting as you might like. But it is spicy, I assure you, because Article 2 of the UUA's bylaws is the one place we have written down in official documentation the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, our set of promises about how we want to be together in religious community. And that section is undergoing a rewrite and is up for a vote at this summer's General Assembly. And part of the revision is that both in a sort of visual representational sense and in a theological sense, that the rewrite puts love at the center. It puts love at the center of who we are, who we purport to be as religious people, as Unitarian Universalists. And it's funny, our affinity for the word love, because you know what word never appears in the 7 principles? Love. Good. You're excellent plants here at the 11 o'clock service. 5 stars. Love doesn't appear in the language we have now to describe how we gather as people of faith. And yet, I think most of us, many of us, and certainly those surveyed by the Articles 2 Study Commission that helped draft this language, heard that over and over and over again from Unitarian Universalists, that this was core to who we are, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our congregations and communities, and how we understand how we interface with the wider world. Love is at the center. But a funny thing about putting love at the center is that we think of it in such sort of joyful terms, right? Love is at the center, like, won't that be nice? Won't that be great? Won't that be such a warm, fuzzy experience? Except that putting love at the center means that there is something else that cannot be at the center when love is there. And it's the thing we like to put at the center best. It's our greatest skill, I think, as human beings. What do we typically enjoy putting at the center? Me. I. Ego. Our own sense of specialness. We put that at the center all the time. Even when we think we're not, even when we think we're better than that or more enlightened than that, my goodness, we are excellent at putting ourselves at the center. And so putting love at the center means that somehow I, me, ego has to move out of the way. And that's hard enough to do as an individual. You could ask any of the many monks or nuns from a variety of religious traditions, right, who Belden Lane talked about in the reading. Those people who go out into the desert and meditate for months on end. It's hard enough to do it when you're just one person, but man, is it even harder when you have to do it with other people? Because, human beings are sort of like love. They're really great in theory. And then you actually have to, do it. You have to actually be in community with other people, and you start to wonder if this human community thing is all it's cracked up to be. Widening our circle and putting love at the center of it means that ego has to find a way out. Or sometimes I think of it, it's about getting out of our own way. How many of you have gotten in your own way? Right, the spiritual and emotional version of tripping over your own feet? Yes. As we consider this moving out of the way of ego, we'll pause for one of my favorite stories of desert survival. Many of you perhaps know the writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry as the author of The Little Prince. It's his best-known work, and it's in fact one of the best-known and most widely translated works of literature, and particularly works of children's literature across the globe. But in addition to being an author, Saint-Exupéry was a pilot, and he ran mail flights from between Northern Africa and Europe throughout the 20s and 30s. And in the mid-30s, he was on a mail flight, right, in a plane whose safety features I think we can all imagine, minimal at best. And his plane crash-landed over the Libyan desert. And in the plane with him, he had what, with all the love in my heart, I can only describe as a very French set of provisions. He had half a liter of white wine and 2 oranges. Not what I would choose to have with me when I crash landed in the Libyan desert. I don't know about you. But that's what he had. And this is the sort of thing that for most human beings, a crash land in the middle of the desert is a death sentence, right? We don't make it out alive of that. But Saint-Exupéry had 2 things going for him. 2 ways that he interacted with that desert that made it possible for him to survive. The first was attentiveness, a deep and profound attention to the world around him that allowed him to notice sort of an unseasonable breeze that had just a little hint of moisture in it, and so he used his parachute to collect dew, which he then drank off of his parachute and sustained himself. A deep attention to the world around him. And the second practice that he used was indifference. Not indifference like the interpersonal indifference that we sometimes think of, but indifference in the sense of indifference to the reality of his circumstances. Right? Part of what happens when many people are stranded in the wilderness or other extreme conditions is that they panic, and it works against them. Think about people who are drowning and start flailing. And that's a very natural human response. I'm not standing up here saying like, I would never panic. Only fools would panic. No, we would all panic. It's a panic-worthy situation to be crash-landed in the middle of the desert, but he didn't panic. And that deep, grounded sense of calm allowed him to move slowly into this dewy breeze and eventually, a few days later, be picked up by a Bedouin caravan and live to tell this tale. When we are in life's deserts, how do we make it out? How do we make it out alive? We pay attention. And when all signs point to panic, we are indifferent. But actually being indifferent to panic in situations in life, whether they be actual literal desert strandings or the sorts of life's deserts that Belden Lane described in this morning's readings, requires moving that me, that I, that ego out of the center. Because if it's all about me, like, yeah, I'm gonna panic. But what becomes possible when I shift away from the center and make space in it for love? That sounds really nice, doesn't it? But the actual experience of doing that, anyone who has done it knows that that is not some sort of nice, blissful, sort of quiet, meditative experience. We sometimes picture folks who do that kind of desert spirituality practice, whether they do it in the literal desert or not, as sort of sitting on their cushions peacefully, reaching enlightenment. Doesn't that sound nice? Maybe you think of losing your ego as a glass being poured out, right? It's an emptying practice. Doesn't that sound nice? But anybody who's actually done it knows that it's not like having your ego poured out of a glass. It's like having the glass smashed with a hammer. That's what it really feels like. Anybody who has gotten in and then out of their own way knows that you cannot do it with your ego intact. You can't. But that it is this dismantling, this unraveling, this smashing into smithereens, that is what makes the space for love to be at the center. That is what makes space to encounter love in its fullness. in what Belden Lane describes so beautifully as unaccountable wonder. It's amazing what is possible, what we are capable of, whether individually or collectively, when we can get that me out of the way and let something more expansive than any of us take its place. It's the experience of profound interdependence, right? The profound sense that whatever happens to me affects you, affects our earth, affects each other. A profound sense that we are actually not that important, and that life's deserts do not particularly care whether we make it across them alive or not. Right, which that's not a very warm, fuzzy, feel-good theology. But sometimes life is not particularly warm and fuzzy. And so we find a way through it. And a funny thing happens sometimes in our justice work as Unitarian Universalists, right? Our work to make the world a fairer, more better, more equitable place, which is that we want to do that kind of work that makes us feel good. Right? We want the warm fuzzies. But the reality is that the kind of social justice, the kind of ministry in that way that really changes lives is often neither warm nor fuzzy. So we're going to take a moment now to window shop another religious denomination's drama. I think of it as looking at the grass on the other side of the fence and remembering that it is not always greener. So I grew up Unitarian Universalist, but I went to a United Methodist seminary. And at the time, it was the beginnings of the controversy that is still, bless them, unfolding in the United Methodist Church around the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the life of the church, both in terms of as lay leaders, as their capacity to get married in the church, and their capacity to serve as elders in full connection, which is basically Methodist for doing all the minister things. And their rule book, which they have, it's called the Book of Discipline, which sounds very fancy. I feel like the UUA, right, we don't even print it anymore. We just have a Word document of rules, which does not feel as fancy as a Book of Discipline, but I digress. So in the Book of Discipline, in the United Methodist tradition, the thing that you cannot be and be in full connection with the church is what's called, hilariously and marvelously, a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which I have always wanted on a business card. Don't you what do you do for work? Well, let me tell you. And that there was a song in the United Methodist circles around that time by gay composer Mark A. Miller called "Draw the Circle Wide." Right? Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. No one stands alone, we stand side by side. And when you hear that song sometimes, divorced from that story, that moment, knowing that this song is a code of sorts for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the life of the United Methodist Church, you might think, doesn't that sound nice? They're going to draw that circle wide. Isn't that nice for them? But the truth is that in its context, that song, that act of drawing the circle wide, is hugely disruptive. Dangerous. People have lost their careers over it. Churches have split over it. Drawing the circle wide disrupts the circle that exists, right? It disrupts the sense of who's in and who's out. And most importantly, perhaps, it disrupts our sense that we are the ones drawing the circle in the first place. Because sure, we draw the circle of our congregation, of our local community, even at the denominational level. We are drawing a circle and trying to include more people at every turn, and yet, the big circle, at whose center is love, is not drawn by human hands. It's the promise of universalism, right? That all are in, no one is out. That there is a circle at whose center is love that you can never leave. And you can never exclude someone from. We draw this circle at whose center is love because it is our work to make our human communities full of us, blessed, bumbling, wonderful human beings such as we are. It is our work to make these circles reflect that larger circle as best we can. Goodness knows we get it wrong multiple times a day. But as the draft language from the UUA's new Article 2 proposal says, we are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Right? The spiritual discipline of love, like any discipline, it implies that you have to practice it. It's not some permanent state of things or some enlightenment that you reach and then never leave. It's a discipline, a practice, a choice. Because while that wider circle will always have love at the center, putting love at the center of our human circle, that takes work. That takes conscientious choice, because goodness knows, even when we are doing the best we can, that me, that I, that ego, right, it just creeps back into the middle. And that even the best and fanciest and most reverend among us, we do it too. Someone between services asked me, have you ever done it? Have you ever gotten your ego out of the center? And I said, once, like, through. We draw our circle wide not because we think it's the popular thing to do or the right thing to do or the politically expedient thing to do. We draw our circle wide and wider, holding love at the center, because we cut ourselves off if we fail to do it. We cut ourselves off from the fullness of human experience. I think we can all think of those moments in communities, whether this community or another one, where, my goodness, we have drawn the circle narrowly. We have drawn a circle with me at the center. And we've missed out. We draw the circle wide and scoot that ego out of the way as best we can at every turn, because that's the work. That's what it means to practice being human together. To be Unitarian Universalist, to put love at the center, to practice that discipline, day in, day out, again and again, failingly, haltingly, fumblingly, humanly. May love be at the center, this day and every day. May it be so. Amen.